Welcome back to Prophecy Reformation Now in this segment, because history is so much a part of prophecy, as all God-given prophecy is history in advance. We're continuing our trek with James A. Wiley through his The History of Protestantism. And today we'll pick up where we left off last time. Chapter 10. Diet at Spires, 1526, and League against the Emperor. A storm rolls away from Wittenberg. Clement hopes to restore the medieval papal glories, forms a league against the Emperor. Changes of the wind. Charles turns to Wittenberg. Diet at Spires. Spirit of the Lutheran princes. Duke John, Landgrave Philip, the word of the Lord endureth forever. Protestant sermons, city churches deserted. The Diet takes the road to Wittenberg. The free towns, the reforms demanded. Popish party discouraged. The Emperor's letter from Seville. Consternation. The storm had been coming onward for some time. The Emperor and Pope, at the head of the confederate kings and subservient princes of the empire, were advancing against the Reformation to strike once and for all. Events fell out in the divine appointment that seemed to pave the way of the assailing hosts and make their victory sure. Frederick, who till now had stood between Luther and the mailed hand of Charles, was at that moment borne to the tomb. It seemed as if the Crusades of the 13th and 14th centuries were about to be repeated, and that Protestantism of the 16th century was to be extinguished in a tempest of horrors, similar to that which had swept away the Albigensian confessors. However, despite the terrible portents now visible in every quarter of the sky, the confidence of Luther that all would yet go well was not to be disappointed. Just as the tempest seemed about to burst over Wittenberg, to the amazement of all men, it rolled away and discharged itself with terrific violence on Rome. Let us see how this came about. Of the potentates with whom Charles had contracted alliance, or with whom he was on terms of friendship, the one he could most thoroughly depend on, one would have thought, was the Pope. In the affair the Emperor now had in hand, the interests and policy of Charles and Clement were undoubtedly identical. On what could the Pope rely for deliverance from that host of heretics that Germany was sending forth, but the sword of Charles V? Yet at this moment the Pope suddenly turned against the Emperor, and, as if smitten with infatuation, wrecked the expedition that Charles meditated for the triumph of Rome and the humiliation of Wittenberg, just as the Emperor was on the point of beginning it. This was passing strange. What motive led the Pope to adopt a policy so suicidal? That which misled Clement was his dream of restoring the lost glories of the popedom and making it what it had been under Gregory VII. We have already pointed out the change effected in the European system by the wars of the 15th century, and how much that change contributed to pave the way for the advent of Protestantism. The papacy was lowered and monarchy was lifted up. But the popes long cherished the hope that the change was only temporary, that Christendom would return to its former state, the true one they deemed it, and that all the crowns of Europe would be once more under the tiara. Therefore, though Clement was pleased to see the advancement of Charles, so far as it enabled him to serve the Roman See, he had no wish to see him at the summit. The Pope was especially jealous of the Spanish power in Italy. Charles already possessed Naples. The victory of Pavia had given him a firm footing in Lombardy. Thus, both in the north and in the south, of the Italian peninsula, the Spanish power hemmed in the pontiff. Clement aspired to erect Italy into an independent kingdom, and from Rome, its old capital, to govern it as a temporal monarch, while he swayed his scepter over all Christendom as its spiritual chief. The hour was favorable, he thought, for the realization of this fine project. There was a party of literary men in Florence and Rome who were full of the idea of restoring Italy to her old place among the kingdoms. This idea was the result of the literary and artistic progress of the Italians during the half-century which had just elapsed, and the result enables us to compare the relative forces of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The first engendered in the bosoms of the Italians a burning detestation of the yoke of their foreign masters, but left them entirely without power to free themselves. The last brought both the love of liberty and the power of achieving it. Knowing this feeling on the part of his countrymen, Pope Clement, thinking the hour was come for restoring to the papacy its medieval glories, opened negotiations with Louisa of Savoy, who administered the government of France during the captivity of her son, and afterwards with Francis I himself when he had recovered his liberty. He corresponded with the King of England, who favored the project, with Venice, with Milan, with the Republic of Florence. And all these parties, moved by fear of the overgrown power of the emperor, were willing to enter into a league with the Pope against Charles V. This, known as the Holy League, was subscribed at Cognac, and the King of England was put at the head of it. Thus suddenly came the change, blind to everything beyond his immediate object, to the risks of war, to the power of his opponent, to the diversion he was creating in favor of Wittenberg. The Pope, without loss of time, sent his army to the Duchy of Milan to begin operations against the Spaniards. While hostilities are pending on the north of Italy, let us turn our eyes to Germany. The Diet, which, as we have already said, had been summoned by Charles to meet at Augsburg, was at this moment assembled at Spires. It had met at Augsburg agreeably to the imperial command in November 1525, but it was so thinly attended that it adjourned to midsummer next year, to be held at Spires, where we now found it. It had been convoked in order to lay the train for the execution of the Edict of Worms and the suppression of Protestantism, but between the issuing of the summons and meeting of the assembly, the politics of Europe had entirely changed. When the emperor's edict passed out of the gates of the Alcazar of Toledo, the wind was setting full toward the Vatican. The Pope was the emperor's staunchest ally, and was preparing to place the imperial crown upon his head. But since the wind had suddenly veered round toward the opposite quarter, and Charles must turn with it, he must play off Luther against Clement. This complete reversal of the political situation was as yet unknown in Germany, or but vaguely surmised. The Diet assembled at Spires on the 25th of June, 1526, and all the electoral princes were present, except the Prince of Brandenburg. The reformed princes were in strong muster, and in high spirits. The fulminations from Spain had not terrified them. Their courage might be read in the gallantry of their bearing as they rode along to Spires, at the head of their armed retainers, with the 5 significant letters blazoned on their banners, and shown also on their escutcheons hung about on the front of their hotels, and even embroidered on the liveries of their servants, VDMIA, that is, Verbum Domini Manet in Atium. The word of the Lord endureth forever. Theirs was not the crestfallen air of men who were going to show cause why they dared to be Lutherans when it was the will of their emperor that they should be Romanists. Charles had thundered against them in his ban. They had given their reply in the motto which they had written on their standards, the Word of God. Under this sign would they conquer. Their great opponent was advancing against them at the head of kingdoms and armies, but the princes lifted their eyes to the motto on their ensigns and took courage. Some trust in chariots, some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. Whoever in the 16th century would assert rank and challenge influence must display a corresponding magnificence. John, Duke of Saxony, entered Spires with a retinue of 700 horsemen. The splendor of his style of living far exceeded that of the other electors, ecclesiastical and lay, and gained for him the place of first prince of the empire. The next after Duke John to figure at the Diet was Philip, Landgrave of Hesse. His wealth did not enable him to maintain so numerous a retinue as Duke John, but his gallant bearing, ready address, and skill in theological discussion gave him a grand position. Bishops he did not fear to encounter in debate. His arsenal was the Bible, and so adroit was he in the use of his weapons that his antagonist, whether priest or layman, was sure to come off only second best. Both Duke John and Landgrave Philip understood the crisis that had arrived, and resolved that nothing should be wanting on their part to ward off the dangers that from so many quarters, and in a combination so formidable, threatened at this hour the Protestant cause. Their first demand on arriving to Spires was for a church in which the gospel might be preached. The Bishop of Spires stood aghast at the request. Did the princes know what they asked? Was not Lutheranism under the ban of the empire? Had not the Diet been assembled to suppress it and uphold the old religion? If then he should open a Lutheran conventicle in the city and set up a Lutheran pulpit in the midst of the Diet, what would be thought of his conduct at Rome? No. While the church's oil was upon him, he would listen to no such proposal. Well, replied the princes in effect, if a church cannot be had, the gospel will lose none of its power by being preached outside the cathedral. The elector and landgrave, who had brought their chaplains with them, opened their hotels for worship. On one Sunday, it is said, as many as 8,000 assembled to the Protestant sermon. While the saloons of the princes were thronged, the city churches were deserted. If we except Ferdinand and the Catholic princes, who thought it incumbent upon them to countenance the old worship, scarce in nave or aisle was their worshipper to be seen. The priests were left alone at the foot of the altars. The tracts of Luther, freely distributed in the Spires, helped too to make the popular tide set yet more strongly in the Reformed direction, and the public feeling, so unequivocally declared, reacted on the Diet. The Reformed princes and their friends were never seen at Mass, and on the Church's fast days, as on other days, meat appeared at their tables. Perhaps they were a little too ostentatious in letting it be known that they gave no obedience to the ordinance of forbidden meats. It was not necessary on Magro Day, as the Italians call it, to carry smoking joints to Lutheran tables in full sight of Romanist assemblies engaged in their devotions in order to show their Protestantism. They took other and more commendable methods to distinguish between themselves and the adherents of the old creed. They strictly charged their attendants to an orderly and obliging behavior. They commanded them to eschew taverns and gaming tables, and generally to keep aloof from the roistering and disorderly company which the diets of the empire commonly drew into the cities where they were held. Their preachers proclaimed the doctrines, and their followers exhibited the fruits of Lutheranism. Thus, all undesignedly, a powerful Protestant propaganda was established in Spires. The leaven was spreading in the population. Meanwhile, the Diet was proceeding with its business. Ferdinand of Austria, it was suspected, had very precise instruction from his brother, the Emperor, touching the measures he wished the Diet to adopt. But Ferdinand, before delivering them, waited to see how the Diet would incline. If it should hold the straight road, so unmistakably traced out in the Edict of Worms, he would be spared the necessity of delivering the harsh message with which he had been charged. But if the Diet should stray in the direction of Wittenberg, then he would make known the Emperor's commands. The Diet had not gone far till it was evident that it had left the road in which Ferdinand and the Emperor desired that it should walk. Not only did it not execute the Edict of Worms, declaring this to be impossible, and that if the Emperor were on the spot, he too would be of this mind, but it threw on Charles the blame of the civil strife which had lately raged in Germany, by so despotically forbidding, in the decree of Burgos, the assembling of the Diet at Spires as agreed on at Nuremberg, and so leaving the wounds of Germany to fester till they issued in seditions and a bloody civil war. It demanded, moreover, the speedy convocation of a general or national council to redress the public grievances. In these demands we trace the rising influence of the free towns in the Diet. The lay element was asserting itself and challenging the sole right of the priests to settle ecclesiastical affairs. The popish members, perceiving how the tide was setting, became discouraged. Nor was this all. A paper was given, August 4th, to the princes by representatives of several of the cities of Germany, proposing other changes in opposition to the known will and policy of the Emperor. In this paper, the cities complained that the poor men were saddled with mendicant friars, who wheedled them and ate the bread out of their mouths. Nor was this all. Many times they hooked in inheritances and most ample legacies. The cities demanded that a stop should be put to the multiplication of these fraternities, that when any of the friars died, their places should not be filled by a new member, that those among them who were willing to embrace another calling should have a small annual pension allowed them, and that the rest of their revenues should be brought into the public treasury. It was not reasonable, they further maintained, that the clergy should be exempt from all public burdens. That privilege had been granted them of old by the bounty of kings, but then they were few in number and low in fortune. Now they were both numerous and rich. The exemption was the most invidious that the clergy shared equally with others in the advantages for which money and taxes were levied. They complained, moreover, of the great number of holidays. The severe penalties which forbade useful labor on these days did not shut out temptations to vice and crime, and these periods of compulsory idleness were as unfavorable to the practice of virtue as to the habit of industry. They prayed, moreover, that the law touching forbidden meats should be abolished, and that all men should be left at liberty as regarded ceremonies till such time as a general council should assemble, and that meanwhile no obstruction should be offered to the preaching of the gospel. It was now that the storm really burst. Seeing the Diet treading the road that had led to Wittenberg, and fearing that, should he longer delay it, it would arrive there, Ferdinand drew forth from his repose in the recesses of his cabinet the Emperor's letter, and read it to the deputies. The letter was dated Seville, March 26, 1526. Charles had snatched a moment's leisure in the midst of his marriage festivities to make known his will on the religious question. In prospect of the meeting of the Diet, the emperor informed the princes that he was about to proceed to Rome to be crowned, that he would consult with the Pope touching the calling of a general council, that meanwhile he willed and commanded that they should decree nothing contrary to the ancient customs, canons, and ceremonies of the Church, and that all things should be ordered within his dominions according to the form and tenor of the Edict of Worms. This was the Edict of Worms over again. It meted out to the disciples of Protestantism chains, prisons, and stakes. The first moments were those of consternation. The check was the more severe that it came at a time when the hopes of the Protestants were high. Landgrave Philip was triumphing in the debate. The free towns were raising their voices. The popish section of the Diet was maintaining a languid flight. All Germany seemed on the point of being carried over to the Lutheran side, when, all at once, the Protestants were brought up before the powerful man who, as the conqueror of Pavia, had humbled the King of France, and placed himself at the summit of Europe. In his letter, they heard the first tramp of his legions advancing to overwhelm them. Verily, they had need to lift their eyes again to their motto, and draw fresh courage from it. The word of the Lord endureth forever. Chapter 11. The Sack of Rome. A great crisis. Deliverance dawns. Tidings of feud between the Pope and Emperor. Political situation reversed. Edict of Worms suspended. Legal settlement of toleration in Germany. The tempest takes the direction of Rome. Charles's letter to Clement VII. An army raised in Germany for the Emperor's assistance. Frundsberg. The German troops cross the Alps. Junction with the Spanish general. United host march on Rome. The city taken. Sack of Rome. Pillage and slaughter. Rome never retrieves the blow. What were the Protestant princes to do? On every hand, terrible dangers threatened their cause. The victory of Pavia, as we have already said, had placed Charles at the head of Christendom. What now should prevent his giving effect to the Edict of Worms? It had hung like a naked sword above Protestantism these 5 years, threatening every moment to descend and crush it. Its author was now all-powerful. What should hinder his snapping the thread that held it from falling? He was on his way to concert measures to that effect with the Pope. In Germany, the Ratisbon League was busy extirpating Lutheranism within its territories. Frederick was in his grave. From the kings of England and France, no aid was to be expected. The Protestants were hemmed in on every side. It was at that hour that a strange rumor reached their ears. The Emperor and the Pope were, it was whispered, at strife. The news was hardly credible. At length came the detailed accounts of the league that Clement VII had formed against the Emperor, with the King of England at its head. The Protestants, when these tidings reached them, thought they saw a pathway beginning to open through the midst of tremendous danger. But a little before, they had felt as the Israelites did on the shore of the Red Sea, with the precipitous cliffs of Abu Daraj on their right, the advancing war chariots and horsemen of Pharaoh on their left, while behind them rose the peaks of Ataka, and in front rolled the waters of the broad, deep, and impassable gulf. No escape was left the terror-stricken Israelites, save through the plain of Badia, which opened in their rear, and led back to the former house of their bondage. So of the men who were now essaying to flee from a gloomier prison, and a more debasing as well as more lengthened bondage than that of the Israelites in Egypt, they were entangled in the land. The wilderness had shut them in. Behind them was the Ratisbon League. In front were the Emperor and the Pope, one in interest and policy as the Protestants believed. They had just read to them the stern command of Charles to abolish no law, change no doctrine, and omit no rite of the Roman Church, and to proceed in accordance with the Edict of Worms, which was as much to say, unsheathe your swords, and set about the instant and complete purgation of Germany from Luther and Lutheranism, under penalty of being yourselves visited with a like infliction by the arms of the empire. How they were escaped from this dilemma, save by a return to the obedience of the Pope, they could not at that moment see. As they turned first to one hand, then the other, they could descry nothing but unscalable cliffs and fathomless abysses. At length, deliverance appeared to dawn in the most unexpected quarter of all. They had never looked to Rome or to Spain, yet there it was that they began to see escape opening to them. The Emperor and the Pope, they were told, were at variance. So then they were to march through the sundered camp of their enemies, with feelings of wonder and awe, not less lively than those of the Hebrew host when they saw the waves beginning to divide, and a pathway to open from shore to shore. Did the Lutheran chiefs and their followers see the hosts of their foes, gathered in one mighty confederacy to overwhelm them, begin to draw apart, and ultimately form themselves into two opposing camps, leaving a pathway between, by which the little Protestant army, under their banner with its sacred emblazonry, "The word of the Lord endureth forever," might march onward to a place of safety. The influence that parted the hearts and counsels of their enemies and turned their arms against each other, they no more could see than the Israelites could see the power that divided the waters and made them stand upright. But that the same power was at work in the latter as in the former case, they could not doubt. The divine hand has never been wanting to the gospel and its friends, but seldom has its interposition been more manifest than at this crisis. The Emperor's edict from Seville, breathing death to Lutheranism, was nearly as much out of date, and almost as little to be regarded as if it had been fulminated a century before. A single glance revealed to the Lutheran princes the mighty change which had taken place in affairs. Christendom was now in arms against the man who but a few months ago had stood at its summit, and instead of girding himself to fight against Lutheranism for the Pope, Charles must now ask the aid of Lutheranism in the battle that he was girding himself to fight against the Pope and his confederate kings. It was even whispered in the Diet that conciliatory instructions of later date had arrived from the Emperor. Ferdinand, it was said, was bidden in these later letters to draw toward Duke John and the other Lutheran princes to cancel the penal clause in the Edict of Worms, and to propose that the whole religious controversy should be referred to a general council. But he feared, it was said, to make these instructions known, lest he should alienate the popish members of the Diet. Nor was it necessary he should divulge the new orders. The astounding news of the League of Cognac That most holy confederation, of which Clement VII was the patron and promoter, had alone suffered to sow distrust and dismay among the popish members of the Diet. They knew that this strange league had broken the bow of the emperor, had weakened the hands of his friends in the council, and that to press for the execution of the Edict of Worms would result only in damage to the man and the party in whose interests it had been framed. In the altered relations of the emperor to the papacy, the popish section of the Diet, among the more prominent of whom were the Dukes of Brunswick and Pomerania, Prince George of Saxony, and the Dukes of Bavaria, dared not come to an open rupture with the reformers. The peasant war had just swept over Germany, leaving many parts of the fatherland covered with ruins and corpses. And to begin a new conflict with the Lutheran princes and the free and powerful cities which had espoused the cause of the Reformation would be madness. Thus the storm passed away. Nay, the crisis resulted in great good to the Reformation. A decree was made at length to this purpose, says Sladen, that for establishing religion and maintaining peace and quietness, it was necessary there should be a lawful general or provincial council of Germany held within a year, and that no delay or impediment might intervene, that ambassadors should be sent to the emperor to pray him that he would look upon the miserable and tumultuous state of the empire, and come into Germany as soon as he could, and procure a council. As to religion and the Edict of Worms, continued the Diet, conferring by a simple expedient one of the greatest of blessings, as to religion and the Edict of Worms, in the meanwhile, till a general or national council can be held, all shall so behave themselves in their several provinces that they may be able to render an account of their doings both to God and the emperor. That is, every state was to be free to act in religion upon its own judgment. Many historians have spoken of this as a great epoch. The legal existence of the Protestant party in the empire, says Ranke, is based on the decree of Spires, 1526. The Diet of 1526, says de Bigny, forms an important epoch in history. An ancient power, that of the Middle Ages, is shaken. A new power, that of modern times, is advancing. Religious liberty boldly takes its stand in front of Romish despotism. A lay spirit prevails over the sacerdotal spirit. This edict was the first legal blow dealt at the supremacy and infallibility of Rome. It was the dawn of toleration in matters of conscience to nations. The same right had still to be extended to individuals. A mighty boon had been won. Campaigns had been fought for less blessings. The reformers had obtained this without unsheathing a single sword. But the storm did not disperse without first bursting. As the skies of Germany became clear, those of Rome became overcast. The winter passed away in some trifling affairs between the papal and the Spanish troops in Lombardy. But when the spring of 1527 opened, a war cloud began to gather, and in due time it rolled down from the Alps, and passing on to the south, it discharged itself in terrible violence upon the city and chair of the pontiff. Before having recourse to arms against the Holy Father, who, contrary to all the probabilities of the cause, and contrary also to his own interests, had conspired against his most devoted as well as most powerful son, the emperor made trial of his pen. In a letter on the 18th of September, written in the gorgeous halls of the Alhambra, Charles reminded Clement VII of the many services he had rendered him, for which, it appeared, he must now accept as payment the league formed against him, at his instigation. "Seeing," said the emperor to the pope, "God hath set us up as two great luminaries, let us endeavor that the world may be enlightened by us, and that no eclipse may happen by our dissensions. But," continued the emperor, having recourse to what has already been the terror of popes, "if you will needs go on like a warrior, I protest and appeal to a council." This letter was without effect in the Vatican, and these two luminaries, to use the emperor's metaphor, instead of shedding light on the world, began to scorch it with fire. The war was pushed forward. The emperor had requested his brother Ferdinand to take command of the army destined to act against the Pope. Ferdinand, however, could not, at this crisis, be absent from Germany without great inconvenience, and accordingly he commissioned Frundsberg, the same valorous knight who, as we have related, addressed the words of encouragement to Luther when he entered the imperial hall at Worms, to raise troops for the emperor's assistance and lead them across the Alps. Frundsberg was a genuine lover of the gospel, but the work he had now in hand was no evangelical service, and he set about it with the coolness, the business air, and the resolution of the old soldier. It was November 1526. The snows had already fallen on the Alps, making it doubly hazardous to climb their precipices and pass their summits. But such was the ardor of both general and army, that this host of 15,000 men in 3 days had crossed the mountains and joined the Constable of Bourbon, the emperor's general, on the other side of them. On effecting a junction, the combined German and Spanish army, which now amounted to 20,000, set out on their march on Rome. The German general carried with him a great iron chain, wherewith, as he told his soldiers, he intended to hang the Pope. Rome, however, he was never to see, a circumstance more to be regretted by the Romans than by the Germans, for the kindly though rough soldier would, had he lived, have restrained the wild license of his army, which wrought such woes to all in the ill-fated city. Frundsberg fell sick and died by the way, but his soldiers pressed forward. On the evening of the 5th of May, 1527, the invaders sighted, through a thin haze, those venerable walls over which many a storm had lowered, but few more terrible than that now gathering round them. What a surprise to a city which, full of banqueting and songs and all manner of delights, lived carelessly and never dreamt that war would approach it. Yet here were the spoilers at her gates. Next morning, under cover of a dense fog, the soldiers approached the walls. The scaling ladders were fixed, and in a few hours the troops were masters of Rome. The Pope and the cardinals fled to their castle of St. Angelo. A little while did the soldiers rest on their arms, till the Pope should come to terms. Clement, however, scouted the idea of surrender. He expected deliverance every moment from the arms of the Holy League. The patience of the troops was soon exhausted. The sack began. We cannot, even at this distance of time, relate the awful tragedy without a shudder. The Constable Bourbon had perished in the first assault, and the army was left without any leader powerful enough to restrain the indulgence of his passions and appetites. What a city to spoil! There was not at that era another such on the earth. At its feet the ages had laid their gifts. Its beauty was perfect. Whatever was rare, curious, or precious in the world was gathered into it. It was ennobled by the priceless monuments of antiquity. It was enriched with the triumphs of recent genius and art, and glory lent it by the chisel of Michelangelo, the pencil of Raphael, and the taste and munificence of Leo X was yet fresh upon it. It was full to overflowing with the riches of all Christendom, which for centuries had been flowing into it through 100 avenues, dispensations, pardons, jubilees, pilgrimages, annats, palls, and contrivances innumerable. But the hour had now come to her, that spoiled and was not spoiled. The hungry soldiers flung themselves upon the prey. In a twinkling, there burst over the sacerdotal city a mingled tempest of greed and rage, of lust and bloodthirsty vengeance. The pillage was unsparing as pitiless. The most secret places were broken open and ransacked. Even the torture was employed, in some cases upon prelates and princes of the church, to make them disgorge their wealth. Not only were the stores of the merchant, the bullion of the banker, and the hoards of the usurer plundered, the altars were robbed of their vessels, and the churches of their tapestry and votive offerings. The tombs were rifled, the relics of the canonized were spoiled, the very corpses of the popes were stripped of their rings and ornaments. The plunder was piled up in heaps in the marketplaces, gold and silver cups, jewels, sacks of coins, pyxes, rich vestments, and the articles were gambled for by the soldiers, who, with abundance of wine and meat at their command, made wassail in the midst of the stricken and bleeding city. Blood, pillage, and grim pleasantries were strangely and hideously mixed. Things and persons which the Romans accounted holy, the soldiery took delight in exposing to ridicule, mockery, and outrage. The pontifical ceremonial was exhibited in mimic pomp. Camp boys were arrayed in cope and stole and chasuble, as if they were going to consecrate. Bishops and cardinals, in some cases stripped nude, in others attired in fantastic dress, were mounted on asses and lean mules, their faces turned to the animals' croup, and led through the streets, while ironical cheers greeted the unwelcome dignity to which they had been prompted. The Pope's robes and tiara were brought forth and put upon a lansquenet, while others of the soldiers, donning the red hats and purple gowns of the cardinals, went through the form of a pontifical election. The mock conclave, having traversed the city in the train of the pseudo-pope, halted before the castle of St. Angelo, and there they deposed Clement VII and elected Martin Luther in his room. Never, says de Bigny, had pontiff been proclaimed with such perfect unanimity. The Spanish soldiers were more embittered against the ecclesiastics than the Germans were, and their animosity, instead of evaporating in grim humor and drollery like that of their Tramontane comrades, took a practical and deadly turn. Not content with rifling their victims of their wealth, they made them, in many cases, pay the forfeit of their lives. Some church dignitaries expired in their hands in the midst of cruel tortures. They spared no age, no rank, or gender. Most piteous, says Guicciardini, were the shrieks and lamentations of the women of Rome, and no less worthy of compassion the deplorable condition of nuns and novices, whom the soldiers drove along by troops out of their convents, that they might satiate their brutal lust amid this female wail, were mingled with the hoarser clamors and groans of unhappy men, whom the soldiers subjected to torture, partly to wrest from them unreasonable ransom, and partly to compel the disclosure of the goods which they had concealed. The sack of Rome lasted 10 days. It was reported, said Guicciardini, that the booty taken might be estimated at 1,000,000 of ducats, but the ransoms of the prisoners amounted to a far larger sum. The numbers of victims is estimated at from 5,000 to 10,000. The population on whom this terrible calamity fell, upon the testimony of their own historians, beyond measure emasculated by effeminacy and vice. Vettori described them as proud, avaricious, murderous, envious, luxurious, and hypocritical. There were then in Rome, says Ranke, 30,000 inhabitants capable of bearing arms. Many of these men had seen service, but, though they wore arms by their sides, there was neither bravery nor manhood in their breasts. Had they possessed a spark of courage, they might have stopped the enemy in his advance to their city, or chased him from their walls after he appeared. This stroke fell on Rome in the very prime of her medieval glory. The magnificence then so suddenly and terribly smitten has never revived. A few days sufficed to nearly annihilate a splendor which centuries were needed to bring to perfection, and which the centuries that have since elapsed have not been able to restore. Okay. Chapter 12. Organization of the Lutheran Church. A calm of 3 years. Luther begins to build. Christians, but no Christian society. Old foundations. Gospel creates Christians. Christ their center. Truth their bond. Unity. Luther's theory of priesthood. All true Christians priests. Some elected to discharge its function. Difference between Romish priesthood and Protestant priesthood. Commission of visitation. Its work. Church Constitution of Saxony. After the storm there came a 3 years' calm, not indeed to that world over which the Pope and his Emperor presided. The Christendom that owned the sway of these two potentates continued still to be torn by intrigues and shaken by battles. It was a sea on which the stormy winds of ambition and war strove together, but the troubles of the political world brought peace to the Church. The gospel had rest only so long as the arms of its enemies were turned against each other. The calm of 3 years, from 1526 to 1529, now promised to that new world which was rising in the midst of the old, was diligently occupied in the important work of organizing and building up. From Wittenberg, the center of this new world, there proceeded a mighty plastic influence, which was daily enlarging its limits and multiplying its citizens. To that we must now turn. The way was prepared for the erection of the new edifice by the demolition of the old. How this came about we have said in the preceding chapter. The emperor had convoked at the Diet at Spires expressly and avowedly to construct a defense around the old and now tottering edifice of Rome, and to raise to its foundation the new building of Wittenberg by the execution of the Edict of Worms in 1521. But the bolt forged to crush Wittenberg fell on Rome. Before the Diet had well begun their deliberations, the political situation around the emperor had entirely changed. Western Europe, alarmed at the vast ambitions of Charles, was confederate against him. He could not now execute the Edict of Worms for fear of offending the Lutheran princes, on whom the League of Cognac compelled him to cast himself, and he could not repeal it for fear of alienating from him the popish princes. A middle path was devised, which tided over the emperor's difficulty and gave 3 years' liberty to the Church. The Diet decreed that, till a general council should assemble, the question of religion should be an open one, and every state should be at liberty to act in it as it judged right. Thus the Diet, the assembling of which the friends of the Reformation had seen with alarm, and its enemies with triumph, seeing it was not to ring the death knell of Protestantism, achieved just the opposite result. It inflicted a blow which broke in pieces the theocratic sovereignty of Rome in the German states of the empire, and cleared the ground for the building of a new spiritual temple. Luther was quick to perceive the opportunity that had at length arrived. The edict of 1526 sounded to him as a call to arise and build. When the reformer came down from the Wartburg, where doubtless he had often meditated on these things, there was a Reformation, but no Reformed church. There were Christians, but no visible Christian society. His next work must be to restore such. The fair fabric which apostolic hands had reared, and which primitive times had witnessed, had been cast down long since, and for ages had lain in ruins. It must be built up from its old foundations. The walls had fallen, but the foundations, he knew, were eternal, like those of the earth. On these old foundations, as still remaining in the Scriptures, Luther now began to build. Hitherto the Reformer's work had been to preach the gospel. By the preaching of the gospel, he had called into existence a number of believing men, scattered throughout the provinces and cities of Germany, who were already actually, though not as yet visibly, distinct from the world, and to whom there belonged a real, though not as yet outward, unity. They were gathered by their faith round one living center, namely Christ, and were knit by a great spiritual bond, namely the truth, to one another. But the principle of union in the heart of each of these believing men must work itself into an outward unity, a unity visible to the world. Unless it does so, the inward principle will languish and die, not indeed in those hearts in which it already exists, but in the world. It will fail to propagate itself. These Christians must be gathered into a family and built up into a kingdom, a holy and spiritual kingdom. The first necessity in the organization of the church, the work to which Luther now put his hand, was an order of men, by whatever name called, priests, presbyters, or bishops, to preach and to dispense the sacraments. Cut off from Rome, the sole fountain, as she held herself to be, of sacred offices and graces, how did the Reformer proceed in the reconstitution of the ministry? He assumed that functions are lodged inalienably in the church, or company of believing men, or brotherhood of priests, for he steadfastly held to the priesthood of all believers. The express object for which the church existed, he reasoned, was to spread salvation over the earth. How does she do this? She does it by the preaching of the gospel and the dispensation of the sacraments. It is therefore the church's duty to preach and to dispense the sacraments. But duty, Luther reasoned, implies right and function. That function is the common possession of the church, of all believers, but it is not to be exercised, in point of fact, by all the church's members. It is to be exercised by some only. How are these some, then, to be chosen? Are they to enter upon the exercise of this function at their own pleasure? Simply self-appointed? No, for what is the function of all cannot be especially exercised by any, save with the consent and election of the rest. The call or invitation of these others, the congregation that is, constituted the right of the individual to discharge the office of minister of the word. For so did the Reformers prefer to style those who were set apart in the church to preach the gospel and dispense the sacraments. In cases of necessity, says he, all Christians may exercise all the functions of the clergy, but order requires the devolving of the office upon particular persons. An immediate divine call was not required to give one a right to exercise office in the church. The call of God came through the instrumentality of man. Thus did Luther constitute the ministry. Till this had been done, the ministry could not have that legitimate part which belongs to it in the appointing of those who are to bear office in the church.